Howdy do, folks. So this is going to be part 3 of our Gameology series on the survival horror genre, so be sure to check out parts 1 and 2 before checking out this one. So in our last segment, we discussed the irrelevance of tank controls and fixed camera angles, something that a lot of people claim is important for something to be a survival horror game, when in reality they are not. It's just a design choice that came about because of developers trying to figure out 3D at the time. So what we're going to do today is actually start getting into the three elements that I say makes up what is survival horror, and those are, once again, the horror elements, the resource management, and combat. And we are first going to start with horror. Now, this isn't so much about how do you make a game scary, because there's no right answer to that question, because everyone is scared of different things. For example, I can't really say that I'm necessarily scared of anything that happens in Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Dino Crisis, or Fatal Frame. But I can say that I am scared of the stuff that happens in System Shock, for example. But there are other people who are scared of the stuff that happens in the games I mentioned, but don't find System Shock scary in the slightest. So what I'm about to tell you here is not necessarily about what is or is not going to scare players, but how you put fear into a player, because that's really what you need to aim to do when you're making a survival horror game, because it's not necessarily a matter of whether or not the player is scared of something when they really think about it, but more if in the moment of gameplay they are afraid. Like, they have that temptation to run away, they have the temptation to fight back, something along those lines. That's what we're going to try to figure out how to do here today. And in order to, explain why, first I need to tell you guys the fundamental difference between a horror movie and a horror video game. So, in a horror movie, how one typically gets fear and horror across is through suspense. The fact that we as the audience know something, but the character in question doesn't. So, for example, in Alfred Hitchcock always used the example, two people are talking and there's a bomb under the table, and as that bomb is ticking down, we as the audience are saying again and again, there's a bomb under the table, there's a bomb under the table, and as the two talking, they start hearing signs that there is a bomb under there, and you're just praying that someone will notice that there is danger underneath that table before it's too late. If you are screaming at a horror film, look out behind you, the killer's right behind you, he's gonna get you, that's how you know a horror movie is doing its job. In a horror video game, it's different. The script is sort of flipped. Rather than you as the audience knowing everything and just trying to alert the character of what's happening, it's more about the fact that you are actually in the shoes of the character you're playing as, and as a result, you yourself don't know what's up ahead, so you yourself get cautious of everything. That is what you need to do in order to achieve horror in a video game. And the question is, how do you do that? Well, for me, it really comes down to the setting. When you're writing a story, one of the big tips that I can give people is to start with the main character and go from there, because they always tell you if you have a good character, you can write any story you want. And when you have that good character, the story will more likely just fall into place naturally. And I feel a similar principle applies to a good horror video game, but rather than starting with the main character, it's important to start with the setting instead. So let's look at the story of the original Resident Evil. So you break it down simply, it's about paramilitary police officers who end up trapped in a mansion full of zombies and have to find a way to escape. Now, on its own, that doesn't sound too interesting, does it? However, Resident Evil is more than just, boo, haunted house. It's not just a random, nondescript mansion that just happens to have zombies in it. There is actually a story at work in Resident Evil in regards to the setting. But what's interesting about it is the story that took place in Resident Evil, you're coming into it after everything is said and done. All the horrible things that happened within the Spencer Mansion, the outbreak of the zombie virus from the Umbrella Lab, all that good stuff. And you learn about that as you play the game. And the reason that is so effective is because it sort of puts you in the shoes of the playable character. You don't know what's going on in this mansion, and as you slowly uncover what the hell is going on, it slowly starts to put fear in you because you hear about the zombie outbreak, people getting infected slowly but surely succumbing to it. And the most famous example being the itchy, itchy, tasty log that you can find. It really unnerves you, not just because in it itself is disturbing, but also due to the simple fact that it makes you wonder, what else is in this mansion? So it's building tension, it's creating fear in the setting, because you yourself don't know what's up ahead, and because that, you're getting paranoid every time you have to use your weapons to defend yourself, because you really want to save that for whatever crazy thing is up ahead. So yeah, I feel like the best thing to do is to start with the setting, because that's really how you're going to achieve fear in a horror game. And because that, characterization tends to be neglected in a lot of ways. I'm sure if you've played Resident Evil, you can't really tell me what the character traits are for Jill or Chris, or really any of the characters. I know later on, characters like Leon develop something of a personality, but the reason for that is the characters themselves aren't really important in this sense. They are more or less just an audience surrogate dragged into this horrible situation and having to figure out what's going on. It serves the means to put you in there. If Resident Evil went deep into the backstories of Chris and Jill, then it would be less effective because it would be taken away from the story of the Spencer Mansion. That's sort of why their characters are neglected in that first game. But there is a way to get character across in regards to the setting if you get creative with your monster. One of the best examples I can think of with this is System Shock. Now, it's debatable whether or not System Shock counts as a survival horror game. I feel it can qualify as one because it does emphasize a lot of the same elements I've been talking about here. Resource management, scares, and combat. Though a lot of people would argue it is immersive sim, but looking at it as a survival horror game, you really do think about how scary this whole situation is. Now, the premise of System Shock is that a rogue artificial intelligence has taken over a military space station. Now, that alone doesn't sound that interesting, but when you really think about how Shodan went rogue, what caused her to go rogue, and everything that she did to take over the station, it really starts to become terrifying because it just speaks to how sadistic this character is and the fact that now all of her wrath is being directed onto you. And based on this is how everything builds from it. The story of everything that happened in the 6 months between the start of System Shock and when you take control of the main character, you start to find it all. The mutant people, the cyborg soldiers, all that stuff. And again, you just start to get really unnerved by it. And that's part of why the setting in System Shock is so effective. This game is one of the only ones that I can say I was actively terrified. Like, I didn't want to finish System Shock because of how scary it was, especially when I was playing the remake. But again, there are other ways you can sort of levy the system. And, one way you can do that while also getting some more character across is, again, leaning on the setting, but in a different way. So a really good example I can think of is Silent Hill, specifically Silent Hill 2, as depicted in that game. Now, if you've played the first Silent Hill, you actually do know a good deal about what's going on in Silent Hill. But if you go into Silent Hill 2 without any knowledge of the original Silent Hill, something else interesting happens. Silent Hill 2 isn't necessarily about the town itself. In Silent Hill 2, it's more about James Sunderland's personal journey through the town and how the town sort of affects him, because what Silent Hill 2 is depicted as in this game is just this damn place where broken individuals are mysteriously drawn to, and as a result, they experience something, and whether or not they are able to escape Silent Hill alive really depends on whether or not they give into their personal demons or, come to terms with them. And what's unnerving about that is the game never gives you a valid reason as to why the town is doing this. Is the town alive? Is it actively manipulating these characters? Is it doing this to help these people? Or is this just the town's way of, surviving? Does it need to consume these people? And that can be really unnerving just because you don't know a great deal about Silent Hill in the game. Now, of course, again, if you played the first Silent Hill, you do understand it, and that actually does bring me to another issue that can arise if you aren't careful. So, with the original Silent Hill, when you first start playing the game, it is very terrifying because, you enter this town, and just the fact that it's empty with this fog over top of it is scary enough. But then all of a sudden you start venturing into the other world, there are monsters running around, you start exploring the town, and you realize that whenever you get to the borders, there seems to be something that's impeding your progress. It's almost as if the town is alive and actively trying to get you, much in the same way Shodan is alive in System Shock. But as you play through the game and you realize that, what is at work here, Silent Hill just starts to lose its luster as a horror setting, and I feel that's because once they explain it, then you know how to deal with it. So that's something else that you need to consider when you're coming up with your setting in a horror game. You need to know just how much information you need to give to the player and really decide if it would be better if the player knew something or if they didn't know something. And it's going to vary depending on what game you're playing. So, for example, going back to Resident Evil, in that game, you get a lot of information about the Spencer Mansion. By the end of the game, you know the whole story, but it still never loses the sense of terror you get from the setting. And that's primarily because while they give you the full story, they never put a face to the people who are behind it, the Umbrella Corporation. Throughout the classic games, the Umbrella Corporation always seems to be this faceless entity. And even though later games do, have some more distinct villains to them, once that starts to happen, it becomes a little more basic, I would say. Umbrella is just scarier when it's just this faceless entity who is willing to do all these unethical stuff. So that's why the horror is never lost in Silent Hill, not Silent Hill Resident Evil. Same thing with System Shock. Shodan is always terrifying, and even when you do manage to one-up her, she always seems to have a backup plan, and they just get darker and darker and darker as you play through the game, and again in Silent Hill 2. The entire time you're playing, a lot of it is just left up to your own personal interpretation. It's very rare that you ever get any concrete answers as to what is actually going on in Silent Hill in that game. So yeah, that's something else to consider. And there are other issues that you can run into when you're making a horror game, and we're going to go over some of the big ones in our next video. I'll see you guys then.